There is Bob Jaeger from Philadelphia. Are you unmuted, Bob?
I think I am. Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great, great, great. So do you want me to jump in or?
Let me just say that we have long been anticipating having Bob Jaeger speak with us. He is an old friend of mine too. I have one friend in every city in the United States. And Bob is the president and the co-founder of Partners for Sacred Places, about which I have been talking from time to time at Saints Luke and James. And I wanted to bring him on board so he could tell us much more cogently than I can exactly what Partners is and what Partners does, so that we can begin to think about whether or not Partners might be able to partner with us. I don't know what that might mean. So Bob, have at it. I'm going to give you, by the way, 45 minutes because we said, so we'll go to 6 afternoon.
Great. Okay, great. Well, good morning, everybody. And it's great to see you. Father Bill, quick question. I love, as you probably recall, conversational presentations, meaning I love interruptions with questions. Is that appropriate with this group rather than waiting to the end?
Absolutely. Very appropriate.
Okay, great. So everybody, you have full permission as I go along to ask a question or interrupt with a thought. So let me see if I can get my screen to work. Aha, all right. So, excellent. Okay. So can you see my slide?
Yes.
Yes.
And do you recognize the church on the upper part of the slide?
That's the church that I belong to.
Christ Church Lutheran, famous, right?
Yes. Yes.
Of course, we've done a lot of work in the Twin Cities, by the way, and I'll probably mention that later, but this is one of the great churches we've had the privilege to work with, both to provide some training and support, and also later they came into our National Fund for Sacred Places, and I've gotten a grant, I think something like $200,000 to help them with their campaign. So I thought it was an appropriate way to start. Also, it's a masterpiece by Eero and Eliel Saarinen, names you know well, I'm sure, in the Twin Cities. So what I wanted to do was talk about how do we make the most of our churches, our sacred places? How do we maximize their value? And I'm going to share some of our findings and some of our work and give you a sense of how we try to be helpful to congregations like yours. And again, since some of this may resonate with you, and as you just said, Father Bill, there's a possibility that we could work together. So I wanted to kind of acquaint you with what we do. Does that sound good to everybody?
Awesome. Thank you.
All right, good. Okay, so a little background on Partners. There I am in the back of this picture at the cathedral, the Catholic Cathedral in Salt Lake City, with a beard. And that was unfortunate, that beard. So that beard is now gone. And now I'm beardless. But this is in 1992 when we were doing one of our national conferences we called Sacred Trusts. And Tom Pike, second from the right, an Episcopal clergyman from New York City, Calvary St. George's Church, you may know that parish in the Gramercy Park area. He was our first chairman. So we're there gathered. It kind of gives you a sense of the kind of people who were together in those early days. But we were responding in part to difficult challenges and crises. For example, you may recall back in the 80s and 90s, St. Bartholomew's on Park Avenue, the famous St. Bart's, was in part endangered. And a court case went all the way up to the Supreme Court about its future. And ultimately, the decision was made to preserve it and save it. So that was one of the crises that led to our founding in the late 80s. One of the first things we did, and something we still do today, is kind of form a library. So one of the things we might be able to do for your parish is simply be helpful in terms of resources, information, publications, on everything from engaging your community, taking care of your building, raising funds, sharing space. So in fact, we're just about to organize it and put it online. we've kind of neglected it for a few years. In the era of Google, we had to think about what role do we have to play for churches to find good information. So but that's one of the first things we did. And then we published things like the Guide to Capital Campaigns, which is the first of only one publication of its kind, serving families. But my narrative really begins with these questions, and these questions go back to the mid-90s, which begins to tell you how long I've been doing this work, and gives you a sense of how old I am. But I remember my board sitting around the table asking questions like, who is served by our churches during the week? What happens in our buildings during the week? Do congregations tend to open up their buildings to serve the larger public? What larger value do they have? And, you know, I don't know about you guys, but I think these are pretty elemental questions, pretty basic questions, like how are our churches serving their communities? But what we learned in the 90s is that no one had those answers. Seminaries did not know. You'd think, you know, they train clergy, right? Religious studies programs did not know. City planning programs did not know. Preservation programs did not know. Judicatories and denominational offices had no answers to any of these questions. So we felt we had better get to work and try to answer them ourselves. So we worked with the University of Pennsylvania, interestingly with the School of Social Work, not religious studies, not preservation, not architecture, but social work, because social workers were beginning to wonder and ask, how is the religious community serving people in need? The poor, the hungry, the homeless, kids, culture. And so we undertook a study, we called it Sacred Places at Risk. Although that's kind of a misnomer, it was less about the at-riskness of churches, although that is certainly the case, but more about how they're used and what public value they had. And we published our findings in the 1990s. And this is the most important thing we learned. And if there's nothing else that you remember from my presentation, I hope you'll remember this pie chart, which said that when we looked at the people who were coming in and out of our churches during the week, not on Sunday morning, but other days to be served, we learned that 4 out of 5 were not members. 4 out of 5 of the people you serve on average are not members. So if I was in the room with you, I would ask you this. It's a little harder to do with Zoom. But anybody have a clue as to why this is important, this pie chart? Anybody willing to venture a thought?
I'll take a stab at it. If we're going to call ourselves a church, we should probably know who, where we should know our community. And this is essential to knowing our community.
Right, right. And does this say, and what is your name, who just spoke?
Pat.
Pat. So does this suggest that you are more than a place of worship?
Absolutely.
Right. And in fact, this is just an opinion that I often share. I don't like the term places of worship.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that's a common phrase, right? I don't like it because it's too limiting. It basically says to civic leaders in Minneapolis or wherever, hey, this is a Sunday morning thing. This is a worship morning thing. And what this tells us is churches are so much more. So much more. And this is key because if we're trying to convince government and philanthropy and business and our neighbors to support us when we need some help to fix the building, or if we want to rethink how we use that old Sunday school wing, which are often sitting half empty, right? A lot of churches, those Sunday school wings are not like they used to be, right? Then we may need some partnership. We may need some help. So we need to help the public understand who we really are and that we're more than just a place of worship. We learned that most urban congregations open up their doors to serve the public, that there's a dollar value to the resources we provide for these programs, and that almost all the good work you do happens in your building. Now, you do other good things. You mentioned the work in Haiti, for example. That's fantastic. But most of a church's good work happens in its own building. So that's kind of its headquarters for that. And, you know, churches often say, oh my goodness, nobody's going to support us. Foundations are not interested in us because we're about religion. right? But we've just started to say, hey, it's about more than that. But look who we serve. Children, basic needs. We provide food and clothing, sometimes housing. And when we talk about funding and funders and foundations, what do they care about? Hunger, kids, homelessness. They care about the very issues that you are tackling in your church. It begins to suggest that there may be new paths to getting support when we're trying to make the most of our church. So we did that research and we went to the Lilly Endowment, which has been a wonderful, consistent supporter now for 30 some years, to say, how do we make this practical? How do we provide this new understanding to churches? We developed this toolkit, which Father Bill knows. And then we developed a training program. And Father Heisley was, back then, was at Mount Olive, right, Bill?
Yes.
And you and your parish were part of this training.
New Dollars for Sacred Places. Yep.
Right, exactly. So this was developed to provide hands-on assistance to help a church discern and articulate that civic value we were just talking about, including measuring the dollar value of the resources you provide, and using that understanding to develop new relationships and create new funding sources and help sustain yourself in new ways. So the research led to a practical end, which is the New Dollars training. And as Father Heisley just said, we did this with the Lutheran Synod in the Minneapolis area back then. And we've done it many, many times since. In fact, that's how we got to know Christ Church Lutheran back then. Mm-hmm. So we did that in the 90s, but in the subsequent years, we realized there was a bigger story here. There's a larger number of ways in which churches serve the community. And we started to realize there's kind of a halo effect for a church, which we love that term, of course, because it's got a double meaning. But if you look at a church, like think about your church on a map, you can almost picture these concentric circles of influence you have in your neighborhood. Like you throw a pebble into a pond and those circles of, in the surface of the pond, you have concentric circles of influence in your neighborhood and in your city. And we want to understand what are the different ways in which a church like yours impacts its community. And we called the overall effect a halo effect. And then we went back to the University of Pennsylvania. And this is even more astounding than that last pie chart. What we learned is the average urban church like yours has an impact each year of $1.7 million. This is a number, this is a fact that most churches have never thought about, have never heard much about, have never documented for themselves. It's composed of several pieces, which I'll talk a bit more about, but it's an astounding number. And, in an era when some folks say churches have zero value because they don't pay taxes, what do they really do? This is, hey, our churches do a great deal, and their presence in the community, that building in the community and how it's shared and used is a big part of this halo effect story. So one of the parts of this, part of it is your budget and your spending. Part of it is the way you share your space. But another part is something we call the magnet effect, which most churches don't think much about. But magnet effect is when you do things or host things that draw people into your neighborhood and they spend money when they come. They come for a concert and they stay for lunch. They come for a wedding and they spend the night. They drive in and they buy gas nearby, And by the way, this is an argument that's made a lot for convention centers and stadiums. Oh, well, it's a bond act for $200 million, but that's okay because people come in and spend money when they come in for a game, right?
Can we get that 200 million?
Yeah, well, yeah, I know. Can you get that 200 million? But the thing is, for every stadium, there are hundreds of churches doing the same thing every week. You draw people in. So that's about 22% of that total pie chart that I just showed you. And look at this on the left. This is a fascinating graph here. This survey was based on research with 90 congregations in 3 cities, okay? Those 90 congregations, it's kind of astounding when you think about it. had almost 3.7 million people coming in and out over the course of a year. 3.7 million. Now, some of the same people again, of course, but some people come once or twice and they never come back. So it's everybody. But look at the pie chart below. What's the percentage of people coming for worship? 11%. So here's my second question for the assembled. Is that a good thing or a bad thing that it's 11%?
That's a good thing.
And why?
Because again, we do more than pray and yeah, it tells the community that we are walking the walk.
I would agree, but is there an argument to be made that it's a bad thing?
You could make a case that the building doesn't need that 11%. We could do other stuff.
Well, yeah, you could, but could you also argue that you want more people to come for worship?
Yep.
So you might want that number to be higher, right?
Yeah.
So, you can look at it both ways, but to echo what you just said, almost half of the people, 49%, are coming for your community programming. The outreach you do, almost half of the people coming and going. Well, I'll tell you, this paints a picture that is very different. I guarantee you guys, this is very different than what your civic leaders think. Okay? When your mayor drives by your church, he's saying, is your mayor he or she?
He.
I can guarantee you, he's thinking, oh, this is a place for Episcopalians worship. That's what he thinks. That's what they all think. Business people, city council members, foundations, they don't know the breadth of what you do. They don't know that your worship attendance is only 11% of the total. That's pretty astounding. This is a very powerful story that we need to tell. And the reason I'm emphasizing this now, this is a national story, but this is also a local story, right? We want America to know this, but we want individual churches to tell their own version of this. Because it will, I guarantee it will get your local leaders to sit up and take notice and say, well, they're a civic resource. That's not to deny it's an Episcopal place of worship, but it's a civic resource. And so that changes their response if you want to work with them, or if you want to get a grant or some support. By the way, we went back to the question of the percentage of people benefiting from the programs you house that were members or not members. Do you remember what it was back in the 90s in that first study, the percentage of beneficiaries that were not members? Anybody remember that number?
81.
81. And it's gone up, in 15 years, it's gone up to 87. We don't know entirely why. One explanation might be that churches continue to shrink, and therefore the percentage of people they serve are likelier to be non-members. But it's now getting close to 90%. So what do we do with this information? And this gets closer, Father Heisley, to what you asked me to talk about, which is what do we do and what kinds of things could your parish think about? And the model we use is what we call asset-based development, or asset-based thinking. Like basically, what do you have in your building, in your place in the community, in your people, in your financial resources? What do you have that you could work with in new ways? And how do you match your assets with the assets around you? This sounds very, very basic, right? Well, of course, but most churches don't think this way. A lot of churches, because they're smaller than they used to be, are kind of fatalistic and they see themselves declining. And they don't think about their strengths. Instead, they think about their weaknesses. And what we're trying to say is, even if you are smaller, that can be okay, because you still have fantastic assets. So how do you find a way to discern and see your assets, and then invite your community to connect what you have to offer and what's around you? The programs, the institutions, the other nonprofits, government, schools, arts agencies, all the other assets around you. And that's a lot of what we do, is try to bring those assets together. So here's an example. We did this with actually the Lutheran Seminary in Philadelphia. Bill, I think you must know them a little bit.
That's where my doctorate is from.
Pardon?
That's where my doctorate is from.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Of course, they have a new name now. They merged with the seminary in
Yep.
Gettysburg. But
Which is where my master's is from.
oh my goodness, I had forgotten that. Well, they were asking questions about their campus and about how they might use those buildings. And so we did some asset mapping. You know, what do they have and what's around the campus and how could they be brought together? So this is a woman who lives in the neighborhood who was a part of this effort. And you see all those Post-it notes? When we go through the process, part of what we do is ask the institution to think of all the assets it has, and not broadly, but very specifically. For example, your sanctuary, it's partly its seating capacity, it's partly the acoustics, it's partly the windows, it's partly the other artistic features, it's partly its suitability for music or for meetings or any number of other things. It may be the pipe organ you have, it might be the piano you have in there, all kinds of things. You know, when a church does this, usually there are 50 to 100 assets that are pretty readily identified. And so what we're doing on that wall is bringing together each Post-it note as an asset, and we're also identifying assets around you, and we're inviting the community to come in and work with the church to bring those assets together and imagine new things, new programs, new collaborations, new outreach that makes the most of your assets and partners with the assets around you. When I say assets, again, it could be the local elementary school. It could be an arts agency. It could be a local business. It could be, you know, a health center. It could be, you know, local musicians. It could be any zillions of assets. And of course, in an urban area like Minneapolis, you are sitting in an embarrassment of riches because Minneapolis is an amazing city with all kinds of assets. So that's what we do. We kind of help a church assemble an advisory committee and then move toward a public event like this, where everybody comes together and say, all right, how could this church be used in new ways? How could it advance its mission in new ways? The other piece we often do, once those assets and ideas are brought together, is we invite architects. And by the way, when we do this, we'll typically work with the local chapter of the American Institute of Architects. And they will almost always recruit architects free, because architects too see our churches as civic assets. So they will come in, they'll participate in the asset mapping, and then they'll help the church imagine, how could that space be used in new ways? What new things could we do with our location? What could we do with that Sunday school wing that's not really terribly well used anymore? What could we do with the parish hall? What could we do with the sanctuary that respects its character, right? You know, we do love old buildings, but also does new things. So that process is called a design charrette. It's a short, intensive design workshop where these architects are looking at the site plan for the seminary, much like you would with the church, and imagining how it could function in some new ways. So here's an example. This is St. Paul's in downtown Syracuse. It had been the cathedral twice, and each time the bishop took the cathedral away. So I don't know why, but the diocese moved to the suburbs of Syracuse, and they were left with an empty parish house, 10,000 square feet. And they really needed to think about how do they bring it to life again. And they had an incredible history of working with immigrants, including people from Sudan. And downtown Syracuse is beginning to kind of demonstrate a renaissance. So they wanted to be a part of that. So again, they went through our New Dollars training that I mentioned. They formed an advisory committee. They did asset mapping and a charrette. Here's an example of some of the bigger ideas they had: music residencies, housing, an elder hostel. Just 3 examples of many that emerged from the asset mapping. And in fact, they continued to work with one of the architects that volunteered their time for this. And now they hired that firm to make plans for their parish house. And they came to partners, my organization, and we brought them into the national fund. So they are now going to get a grant of $250,000 to help them advance their plans to bring their parish house back to life. Another thing we're doing that emerges from this understanding of civic value is help churches match their space with groups that are looking for space. And you know, we want to help a church understand what it has, how it might consolidate its functions and make spaces fully available for some other things, particularly the arts. We're finding that in every major city, the performing arts in particular is often looking for better space. So here's my third question, everybody. Of the major performing arts sectors, music, theater, and dance, can you guess which of the three is typically most desperately in need of new space?
Dance.
Correct, dance. They are often lacking decent rehearsal space with wood floors and high ceilings, good light, heated, something that churches have in abundance, right? I remember meeting once with a contemporary dance group director in Baltimore. They were rehearsing an unheated warehouse with concrete floors. If you know
Hmm.
anything about dance, that's a terrible place to rehearse. And we said we wanted to work to help find churches that might be willing to share space with her. She was in tears because it never occurred to her that she might find a church that might have a parish hall or another space that would be good for her. So arts, we have a full-time person funded by foundations to help match churches that have space with arts groups that are looking for space. So this is a national need. I mentioned the National Fund. This is another thing we do. We've raised about $30 million so far. And we're going to be helping about 100 to 120 churches, most of them with grants about $250,000. Does anybody recognize this church?
I do.
Well, Bill, you used to live here, so you really should
Yeah, it's Old Christ Church in Old City, Philadelphia.
where Benjamin Franklin sat and
Yeah.
George Washington and John Adams. And they needed to work on their steeple. They took on a major project, so they were one of the first that came into the fund. But we've had church, I think in Minneapolis, we now have 2 or 3. We just brought in the Church of the Covenant downtown, right near the stadium, if you can picture that. That's the mother
Yeah,
church of the Swedish Church of the Covenant. They just came.
right.
Yeah. You might like to hear, especially since you are where you are, which is Minnesota, you might like to know that we have a program helping Nordic churches in the upper Midwest. And Minnesota, Wisconsin, the Dakotas, Iowa, and upper Michigan are all included. And we're inventorying them and providing help for these churches to preserve their buildings and their folk arts, by the way. Altar paintings, carvings, wrought iron fences, that kind of thing. Here's something else that you might find this intriguing. We found funders that wanted to help us bring new audiences to the great pipe organs that our churches often have, doing concerts, funding repairs, doing a survey, so that neighborhoods are drawn into our older churches to experience them and their pipe organs, which these days, as you can imagine, are often not very well understood, often not heard, and certainly the audience for them can be much larger. So that's been our goal. We're studying, I mentioned the Halo study. We're now doing it with rural churches also. So we've done it with urban. We're now doing a rural study in North Carolina, funded by the Duke Endowment. We're doing more work in Nordic. We're doing work in Appalachia. Here's an interesting thing, and Father Heise, I can send you a link, which you're welcome to share. Literally about 2 weeks ago, we published a guide for religious places that are kind of going through transitions, like we've been talking about. And it may be as modest as, hey, we have some empty space, and as major as, hey, we need to leave, we need to sell. But what we want to do is encourage religious leaders to be thoughtful and consider all the options rather than just giving it to the local realtor and say, do what you will, which sometimes means that a great old church will be demolished or gutted. And so we want to encourage churches to think, and Episcopal leaders and Lutheran leaders and others to think, to slow down a little bit and think about some of the alternatives to keep these places as civic places and not necessarily making them into condos, which is what you find in New York, for example, a lot.
Which is what's happening to St. James.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
And sometimes that is a good thing, but it isn't always necessary. So, Father Bill, I have raced along, realizing that we have only so much time. And how much time do we have left?
We have about 15 minutes.
Great.
I want someone to talk to you and talk to us about the Saints Luke and James Dream Team. I have not told you about this, Bob. I'm not the priest who coordinates with them. That is Larry Bussey, who is also here today. So I'm wondering if someone from the Dream Team would sort of cue in Bob to what it is and what has been going on, and to the chat that's been happening during his show, because it's been inspired by you, Bob.
Great.
Who will do that? Fiona, do you want to?
Sure. So yeah, we got a grant with the Lilly Foundation. There's a group called the Riverside Innovation Hub down in downtown Minneapolis. And it covers a lot of what you were talking about finding out what the community needs, finding out what our strengths are, and finding out where those intersect.
Right.
And so that's what we've been doing for the past 3 years, I think now. And it's been it's been challenging too with COVID, and then combining churches, and so we're kind of going through the process again, but it's a cyclical type of thing where you're supposed to be constantly going back out into the community, coming back to your church, figuring out what you need. And so, yeah, that has been really fascinating. And I think those of us who have been through that process have learned a lot about the neighborhoods that we live in, that our church lives in, because a lot of us don't actually live in those neighborhoods. And so, we've been trying to like go to community meetings or join community Facebook groups, and just see what's out there and look at our church in a new light. And I think part of that, we've sort of looked at our front yard, we call it the front porch now, and trying to restructure that so it's more of a neighborhood area instead of just like some pretty grass. And we've added like food boxes out there, and a little free library and things like that. So I think I feel like I've seen a lot of growth in our connections to the community over the past few years.
I'm glad you mentioned your front porch, because part of what we look at is green space, open space, which is an asset, right?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And it's a great way to connect, because it's not as intimidating as walking into the church.
Right. Are there other churches involved in that project as well?
Yeah, there's a lot. I don't know how many.
Are they only Episcopal, or is it interdenominational?
I think we're the only Episcopal, actually.
All the rest are Lutheran churches. We were the Episcopal church.
Well, there are a lot of Lutheran churches around, are there not? My family comes in part from Grand Rapids, Michigan, and there the Dutch Reformed Church reigns supreme. So every block there's a Dutch Reformed Church. So in Minnesota, there's a lot of Lutheran. Well, that's great. That's exciting. And when does that project end, Fiona?
Well, the grant, or like the grant program, I guess, ends this summer. But so, we're kind of in a transition time now where we're trying to figure out how we're going to keep it sustaining and what we're going to do in the future.
If I may, I'd like to mention, I did join the Dream Team a little later, not right at the beginning, but I was in probably a year ago, maybe more, on a conversation that was fascinating to me, because one of our team members said, let's think about what if we had to leave our building and we had to sell it to someone, what would they do with it? And then we had kind of a popcorn kind of thing, knowing what we knew about the neighborhood. Well, they would make it a center for the arts. There could be music there. There could be studios there. There could be pottery and uh, painting and any kind of artist that could use some of the space.
Mhm.
And then the original suggesting person said, well, what if we did with our building what somebody who bought it would do? What would prevent us from doing those things in our building? And it was just an absolutely electrifying conversation. People were very excited, uh, and I mean, I think maybe even before that, they had come up with the phrase "a spiritual hub for the community."
Mhm.
But I think the the possibilities there, especially with the combination of the two parishes into a new parish, and the vision and values work that's been done, uh, it's it's very possible that that could come into fruition. And what you've given us today, Bob, is even more support for an idea like that.
Mhm. Yeah, I love that story because I mean that's kind of an asset matching story. You may, in that imaginary scenario, the parish may not be there, but you're trying to think, well, what would this neighborhood want with this space? And if they took it on, would it become an art center in effect? And you might have a whole range of different art uses. So in effect, you're imagining a matching of asset with need in the community. And you know what, when we do this, we often find that a church has some good ideas and some good suspicions or guesses as to what the community might want to do. But when we do this asset mapping process and the community comes in to walk through the building and then talk about it together, often some new things emerge that you might not expect. So it ends up being a mix of what you might have predicted and things you might not have predicted that all come together. Anne, it looks like you're ready to add something.
Yes. Uh, this is just a thing that came to me the minute that you started talking, and that was to bring it down to the individual person who is a member of a church like ours or any, and what kind of how broadening that is, and how incredible it is for the individual parishioner who can now look beyond Sunday.
Mhm, mhm.
And that's just a way of putting it, because many of that I see do things outside. But I'm just saying that for the church, for the individuals within it, it broadens them incredibly and makes their life more rich. And I don't know if you've done any research on or thinking about how that sells to the individual in a parish. But
Well, it does awaken individuals as well as the larger congregation. I think a lot of people, they come Sunday and maybe they come occasionally on some other day, but a lot of people are pretty oblivious to what goes on. We meet many church folks, not the clergy, but lay people who really have no idea what goes on during the week. And this
I
really
have found that many clergy are oblivious, period.
oh dear.
Say, Bob, I have
Yes,
a question.
yes.
We're in the process of choosing a name for this merging transition group.
Mhm.
And I'm wondering if any of your research has any insights into the impact of a name in the community in terms of how people view us or view any church, because it's sort of fascinating to me. I mean, a name can be imaginative and unlimiting, or it could be very narrow. I'm just curious.
Well, that's a great question, Benita. And a name kind of sums up your story or what you're trying to say about you and what you're offering to the community. And one thing I have noticed when we do training with congregations on this stuff, sometimes the story they tell or the case they make relies way too much on religious terminology, which we're all comfortable with, But I'll tell you, it's not easy for the community to relate to it. And so we always encourage them, to affirm your faith community, to affirm your identity, of course, but also to use language that people can understand and embrace. And you might even test it. I mean, I would recommend it, because when we talk to churches about telling a story and developing a case for why people should care about them, one of the things that happens is they, in effect, are talking to neighbors and talking to their community, and in effect, testing it. They're getting people's reaction to the words they're using. And you might consider that. It's almost like a little bit of asset thinking. Here's what we are. Here's the names we're thinking of. Here are the words we're considering. What do you think?
Bruce Bain Carlson has his hand up.
So I got I guess, a couple of questions, more from the financial aspect of this. So you provide a service. What's the cost of said service if St. Luke's and James was to engage in this with your organization? I think that, well, let's just start there.
Okay. Well, we've talked about a few things. It depends on what it is. We will work with the church to do our New Dollars training, which is about helping a church articulate its story and make a better case for itself in the larger community. That's New Dollars, New Partners. That's what Father Heisley has been through. That's a relatively modest cost, a few $1,000s, ideally in person. Given that we're starting to emerge from the pandemic, we can imagine going to places like Minneapolis again. Thank God, thank goodness. The more time-intensive work is when we work with a church to assemble an advisor committee and go through the asset mapping process. That usually involves several meetings with the advisors and then a public event, and usually 30 to 50 civic leaders. And I'm talking about high-level leaders from all the sectors we've been talking about: philanthropy, education, culture, government, neighborhood groups, social services, all the sectors we can think of, to do this asset mapping process that I've described. And then the design charrette costs a little bit more, but not a lot more, because the architects are doing their work free. They do it pro bono. Our time is somewhere in the $15,000, $20,000 range. But this is, you have to understand, this is not a weekend. This is about 6 months worth of work with a church. But it kind of varies depending on how you define the scope of work, but that gives you a rough idea.
And in the churches that you've worked with, do you have an idea, an average rate of return, if you will, on said investment to your, what are the churches seeing in income into their annual budgets compared to what they've invested in hiring your firm to come in and help?
Well, it depends how you define return. Some churches end up doing a capital campaign, and they may be raising $500,000, $1 million or more. So you're kind of comparing that early investment to the money they raise. Sometimes it can result in new tenants, or I hate the word tenant for a church. I like to say the shared space user, meaning they share your space with you, because they should be another way to live out your purpose, right? We don't really believe in churches being landlords just for whoever. We really believe that the new users of space should be a reflection of your mission. It's interesting. I don't know if we've ever done a study indicating exactly how much new rental income churches have obtained. So I don't know if I can answer that directly, but I know we've done a lot of work with churches that are moving in a capital campaign. So in effect, it's an investment in persuading the community to help them invest in their buildings. So one good example that I did not include in my PowerPoint is University Lutheran Church in Cambridge. I don't know how many of you know the Harvard area, but it's like a block away from the Harvard campus. And we did all these things. We did the New Dollars training, we did the asset mapping, we did the design charrette, and they were really short of space. They had a very squeezed in kind of small site, but they wanted to serve the arts in new ways. They were thinking about serving the homeless in new ways. They were trying to create some new space. So in their case, they may have new uses of space that may produce more rental income, but their primary goal was to lay the foundation for a capital campaign. And they're now prepared to raise between $1 and $2 million to invest in their building. So that's ultimately the payoff for them, was laying the groundwork for the community to get to know them and to work with them. And then that made it easier to go and ask for their help when it came time to the capital campaign. By the way, I haven't quite said this. One thing we believe in is that congregations should no longer depend entirely on themselves for capital money. That's always been the way churches operate, right? Almost 100% of every capital campaign came from members. And our belief is that's got to change, because you are a civic place. So if you're going to be investing in your roof or better accessibility or new bathrooms or a new furnace, then you can and you should go to your neighbors and to larger funders, secular or not, and ask them for support. And all this work we're talking about prepares the way, because it helps with your planning, helps you think about your space, it develops new relationships, it helps them get to know you. So that church in Cambridge, they no longer see them as just a little Lutheran church in a mid-century building, which by the way is a really good mid-century building. That's a good thing. But they see them now as a civic player, as a place that wants to maximize its assets to serve the arts and the homeless and other key populations in the Cambridge area. And if you can
Bob Jaeger,
yes,
one last sentence.
I'll just say that, you know, there are a lot of communities where it's hard to know how to make the most of what you have. You know, and it was the case there, and it may be the case with you. But I think some of this work can really be the key to opening up the door to new relationships and new funding and new ideas.
Thank you. The website is sacredplaces.org. Is that correct?
That's right.
Okay, sacredplaces.org. We are over time. I apologize for having ate up too much of your time. A big round of applause for Bob Jaeger from West Philly.
That's right. Thank you.
Great to see you, Bob.
Thank you.
Great to see all of you. We are therefore ready to say adieu until next week. Well, until all of the stuff that goes on this week. Right? We have 2 meetings tomorrow and it goes on and on. It's great. Take care.